When Clint Eastwood sat down at a quiet café in Carmel, California, no one paid much attention to the legendary actor and director. But one little girl did. She wasn't interested in his movies or his fame. She was drawn to something else, a simple, worn-out necklace resting against his chest. What she didn't know was that this necklace carried a lifetime of stories, of hardship, of resilience. And when she finally asked about it, Clint's response didn't just answer her question, it changed her life forever. Because in true Clint Eastwood style, he turned this moment into an unforgettable lesson about strength, loss, and the power of passing hope forward. The golden afternoon sun bathed the small-town cafe in Carmel, California, casting soft shadows across the wooden patio. A gentle ocean breeze carried the distant sound of waves crashing against the cliffs, mixing with the clinking of silverware and the quiet hum of conversation. At a corner table, Clint Eastwood sat alone, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. His cowboy days were long behind him, but even at 94, there was something unmistakable about him. The sharp blue eyes, the strong jawline, the quiet presence. Time had softened him, but the legend remained. He gazed out toward the horizon, watching the surf roll in, his thoughts lost somewhere between the past and present. At a nearby table, a little girl, no more than 7 or 8, sat beside her mother, swinging her legs beneath her chair. Her curly blonde hair bounced with every movement, and her wide blue eyes flickered toward Clint, again and again. But she wasn't staring, because she recognized him. She had no idea she was sitting near one of the most iconic actors of all time. No, she was staring at his necklace. It wasn't flashy. Just a simple silver pendant hanging from a thin chain, resting against the old denim of Clint's shirt. The girl couldn't explain why, but something about it intrigued her. Maybe it was the way he occasionally reached for it, absent-mindedly, his fingers grazing over the metal like it was something more than jewelry. She watched him closely, thoughtfully, her mind racing with questions. Her mother was busy checking her phone, occasionally glancing up to remind her daughter to finish her lemonade. But the little girl wasn't thinking about lemonade. She was thinking about that necklace. Finally, after minutes of watching and wondering, she made up her mind. She slid off her chair, her sneakers softly hitting the wooden deck. Her mother barely noticed as she took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage she had. Then, hesitantly, she stepped toward Clint Eastwood. The little girl stopped a few feet from Clint's table, her hands clasped together nervously. For a moment, she thought about turning back. Maybe she was being silly. Maybe he wouldn't even hear her. But then, with a sudden burst of confidence, she stepped forward and tugged gently at the sleeve of his jacket. Clint looked up slowly, his gaze meeting hers. For the briefest second, there was silence. The little girl swallowed hard, then spoke in a soft, hesitant voice. "Mister, why do you wear that necklace?" Her mother, hearing her daughter's voice, turned toward the scene, her eyes widening in alarm. "Sophia," she whispered sharply, "you can't just—" But Clint raised a gentle hand, signaling that it was all right. He didn't laugh or brush her off like most adults might have. Instead, he studied her, really studied her. There was something familiar in her expression. That innocent, unfiltered curiosity, that raw, unafraid honesty only children possess. Slowly, Clint leaned back in his chair, setting his coffee cup down. Then he glanced down at his necklace, lifting it slightly so that it caught the golden afternoon light. The pendant, old and worn, twinkled like a secret waiting to be told. His fingers traced the edge of the metal, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "That's a good question," he said finally, his voice low and thoughtful. The girl's face lit up with excitement. She had expected a simple answer. She had no idea she had just unlocked a story that would change her forever. Clint lifted the pendant slightly, letting the late afternoon sun catch its edges. The silver was dulled with age, the metal worn smooth from decades of being held, touched, and remembered. It wasn't flashy or grand, not the kind of thing you'd expect a Hollywood legend to wear. It was simple, small, round, with a faint engraving on its surface. The design had faded over time, but it was still there, etched like a whisper from the past. The little girl's blue eyes stayed locked on it, her fingers twitching at her sides, itching to reach out and touch it. "It doesn't look special," she said softly, tilting her head. Clint chuckled, a deep, quiet sound. Most important things don't. He rolled the pendant between his fingers, his gaze drifting, not at the cafe, not at the ocean, but somewhere far away. For a long moment, he didn't speak. The little girl could tell he wasn't ignoring her. He was remembering something important, something that wasn't meant to be rushed. Then, finally, he looked back at her, his expression softer now. "Do you really want to know the story?" She nodded, almost bouncing on her heels. Clint smiled at her eagerness. It reminded him of someone. He let out a slow breath, leaning forward slightly, his voice lowering to a steady, thoughtful rhythm. "All right, kid," he said, gripping the pendant tightly, before letting it rest against his chest again. "I'll tell you." And with that, he began. Clint rested his elbows on the table, his hands gently clasping the pendant. The little girl, sensing something important was coming, plopped down on the wooden deck, crossing her legs. Her mother, watching from a few feet away, hesitated. She wasn't sure whether to pull her daughter back, to apologize for the intrusion, or to let this moment play out. But then she saw it, something rare, something unexpected. Clint Eastwood, a man known for his tough exterior, looked different now. There was something deeper in his eyes, something that made her stay silent and just listen. He ran his thumb over the pendant once, twice, as if feeling the weight of it all over again. "A long time ago," he started, "someone gave this to me, someone who changed my life." The little girl leaned forward, completely hooked. "Who?" she whispered. Clint exhaled, his gaze drifting once more. "Her name was Miss Eleanor." The girl scrunched up her face. "Was she your mom?" Clint chuckled softly. "No, kid, but in a way she was just as important." He shifted in his chair, the memory pulling him back through time. "I was just a boy," he continued, "and times were tough. Tougher than you'd ever believe." He explained how he grew up during the Great Depression, how money was scarce, food was scarcer, and survival meant learning to go without. The little girl's face fell. She couldn't imagine a life where dinner wasn't always on the table. "People don't realize," Clint said, his voice almost distant. "Some kids back then didn't have shoes, some didn't have homes. We lived on whatever we could get." The girl's eyes widened. "Did you have a home?" Clint hesitated, then nodded. "Sometimes." He told her about how his family moved constantly, chasing work wherever they could find it. Some nights they had a roof over their heads, other nights they didn't. And in the middle of all that, there was Miss Eleanor. "She was my teacher," Clint said, a small, nostalgic smile playing on his lips. "But she was more than that. She saw something in me that no one else did." The little girl sat up straighter, hanging on to every word. "She gave me this necklace," Clint said, lifting the pendant slightly. "Told me to keep it. Said it would remind me that no matter how hard life got, I was strong enough to get through it." The little girl blinked, staring at the pendant like it had just become something magical. Clint let out a small sigh, his fingers closing around it once more. And she was right. The girl didn't speak. She couldn't. Because for the first time in her young life she realized sometimes the smallest things carry the biggest meanings, and this necklace, it wasn't just metal. It was a promise that had lasted a lifetime. Clint leaned back slightly, the faint hum of the café fading into the background. His fingers, steady despite the years, traced the pendant's smooth surface. "I was about your age when I met her," he said, his voice quiet, almost distant. The little girl's blue eyes widened. "Miss Eleanor?" Clint nodded. "She was my teacher," he continued, "but she was more than that. She was the first person outside my family who ever truly believed in me." The little girl furrowed her brows. "Didn't your family believe in you?" Clint smiled faintly. "They did. But life was hard, and when things get tough, people don't always have time for dreams." The girl didn't quite understand what that meant, but she knew enough to realize he wasn't just talking about school. "Miss Eleanor saw something in me," Clint said. "I wasn't the smartest kid, I wasn't the fastest, but she told me I had something else." The girl tilted her head. "What?" Clint chuckled softly. "Grit." Her face scrunched up. "What's grit?" He smiled, his thumb rubbing over the pendant again. "It means you don't quit, no matter how tough things get." The little girl sat up straighter, nodding as if she understood. "So she gave you the necklace because she thought you had grit?" Clint's eyes softened. "Not exactly." He lifted the necklace slightly, letting the light catch the faded engraving. "She gave it to me because she knew I'd forget." The girl blinked. "Forget what?" Clint smiled, a small, knowing look in his eyes. "That I was strong enough." She didn't say anything at first. She just stared at the necklace, as if seeing it for the first time. "So, you never took it off?" she whispered. Clint shook his head. "Never." For the first time, the little girl realized this wasn't just an old necklace. It was a promise, one he had carried with him through his entire life. And that promise, it had never broken. The little girl's fingers fidgeted in her lap. She had a million questions, but one burned in her mind the most. "Why was she so important to you?" she asked. Clint exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting, not at the café, not at the ocean, but somewhere much farther away, somewhere in the past. "Because, kid," he said, "she was the first person who ever made me believe I could be more than just a poor kid from nowhere." The girl's small hands gripped the edge of the table. "Were you really poor?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Clint nodded. "More than you can imagine." The café faded around them as he spoke. "I grew up during the Great Depression," he explained. "That means there wasn't a lot of food, or money, or anything really." The girl's eyes widened. She had never met anyone who lived during the Great Depression. "We moved all the time," Clint continued, "never in the same place for too long. My father took any job he could find, and sometimes there wasn't one at all." The girl frowned. "Did you have a house?" Clint hesitated. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "but sometimes we didn't." She looked at him in shock. "You were homeless?" Clint smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that meant happiness. "Not all the time, but there were nights when all we had was a car to sleep in, or a barn, or a friend's floor." The girl sat completely still, like she was afraid moving would break the moment. "Did you have toys?" she asked hesitantly. Clint shook his head. "No, kid. Toys were for kids who could afford them." The girl bit her lip. She had never thought about toys like that before. "Then what did you do for fun?" Clint smirked, shaking his head. "We made do. We played outside. We told stories. We worked." The girl's face scrunched up. "You worked?" He nodded. "When you don't have money, everyone helps. I worked odd jobs, whatever I could find. Miss Eleanor always said I had strong hands for my age." She stared at his hands now, weathered but steady. She believed it. "Was it scary?" she asked quietly. Clint looked at her, really looked at her. "Yeah." The girl's throat tightened. She didn't know why, but her chest felt heavy. "Then how did you get through it?" Clint smiled, lifting the necklace slightly. "Grit." And with that, the little girl understood. She wasn't just listening to a story. She was listening to a lesson, one that had carried Clint through an entire lifetime. And deep down, she knew it was a lesson she'd never forget. Clint's fingers traced the pendant once more, as if feeling the weight of Miss Eleanor's words all over again. The little girl sat motionless, her breath caught in her throat, her wide blue eyes locked onto his. Miss Eleanor was different, Clint said, his voice steady but distant, as if the memory had transported him back in time. She saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. The little girl's brows furrowed. Like what? Clint smirked faintly. Potential. The girl tilted her head. What's that? Clint chuckled, the deep, quiet laugh of a man who had spent a lifetime understanding that very question. It means she thought I could be something more than just a kid with empty pockets. The girl blinked, absorbing that thought. She told me not to let where I came from decide where I was going, Clint continued. She said that being poor wasn't a life sentence. It was just a chapter, and chapters change. The little girl nodded slowly. She didn't fully understand, but she could feel the importance of it. Clint exhaled, his gaze fixed on the pendant. One day when things were especially bad, I told her I didn't think I was ever going to make it. The girl leaned in slightly. And you know what she did? The little girl shook her head. Clint lifted the necklace again, letting it rest in his palm. She gave me this. The girl's breath hitched. She said, "Keep this, Clint, and when life gets tough, remember, you are stronger than you think." The little girl gasped, her tiny hands pressing against her chest. It wasn't just a necklace. It was a reminder, a promise, a lifeline for a boy who had nothing else to hold on to. Clint smiled faintly, watching her reaction, and she was right. The waves crashed softly in the distance, the golden sunlight casting long shadows over the café deck. But the little girl didn't notice any of it. All she saw was the necklace. All she heard was the weight in Clint's voice. "Did it really help you?" she asked quietly. Clint's fingers curled around the pendant, more times than I can count. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing slightly as memories flickered through his mind like scenes from an old film reel. "When I joined the Army, I had it with me." The girl's mouth parted in surprise. "You were in the Army?" Clint nodded. "I was just a young guy, didn't know a damn thing about the world. Some days I thought I wasn't going to make it through. But whenever I felt like giving up," he lifted the necklace again. "I held on to this." The girl swallowed hard, her small hands gripping the hem of her dress. Clint smiled faintly. "Then, when I came back, I thought maybe I could do something bigger. I wanted to act. But that's not an easy dream, kid. It's a whole lot of people telling you you're not good enough." She frowned. "That's mean." Clint smirked. "That's life." The girl thought about that for a second, then nodded. She was beginning to understand. "Every time I failed, every time I got knocked down, I thought about taking this necklace off. Thought maybe I wasn't cut out for something bigger." His voice lowered slightly, his grip tightening around the pendant. "But then I'd remember her words." The little girl swallowed hard. "You are stronger than you think." Clint nodded slowly. "That's right." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't empty. It was full. Full of everything he had been through, everything he had fought for. The little girl blinked rapidly, trying to stop the tears forming in her eyes. Clint noticed and smiled gently. "Ah, come on now, don't go crying on me." She sniffled, wiping at her face quickly. "I'm not." Clint chuckled. "Good, because this story isn't over yet." And somehow, the little girl knew, neither was hers. For a moment, the little girl sat still, her fingers tightening around the edge of her dress. She had been listening so intently, hanging on every word, but now something shifted. She hesitated. Clint noticed. His sharp blue eyes, weathered by time and experience, saw it before she even spoke. The way her shoulders tensed, the way she suddenly looked down, the way her little fingers started twisting at a loose thread on her dress. She wasn't just listening to his story, she was remembering her own. The cafe noises faded into the background, the ocean waves crashed softly, a rhythmic heartbeat in the distance. Finally, in the smallest, quietest voice, she spoke. "My dad had a necklace too." Clint didn't say anything. He just listened. The girl swallowed hard, blinking fast as if she wasn't sure she should continue, but the words pushed their way out anyway. He passed away last year. Her voice wavered at the last word. Clint sat back slightly, his expression unreadable, but his eyes softened. The little girl sniffled, rubbing her arm absently. I miss him. There it was. The words she'd wanted to say for so long, the words she never really said out loud because grown-ups always tried to make her feel better right away. They always said things like, he's in a better place, or it'll get easier. She didn't want it to get easier. She just wanted him back. Sometimes, she took a shaky breath, I feel like I'll never be happy again. Clint let the silence settle. He had heard that kind of pain before. He had felt it before, and he knew better than to fill it with empty words. Instead, he simply nodded, a small, quiet motion, because he understood, because there are some kinds of pain that never really go away. The breeze swept gently through the cafe patio, lifting the edge of the white tablecloth. A couple laughed softly at a nearby table, their voices distant, their worlds separate from this moment. Clint tapped his fingers lightly against his coffee cup, then looked at the little girl, really looked at her. I lost people too, he said, his voice low, steady, and I know this. When someone loves you, they never really leave. The girl sniffled, her small fingers clutching at the fabric of her dress. Clint lifted his hand and tapped 2 fingers lightly against his chest. They stay in here. The girl's lower lip quivered. She pressed a hand over her heart, as if testing his words. Clint nodded. That's the thing about love, kid. It doesn't disappear. It doesn't just stop. It stays with you. The girl wiped at a tear rolling down her cheek. She wanted to believe that, really believe it. Clint sighed, shifting slightly in his chair. I won't lie to you. Missing someone, that never goes away. Some days it's just a little whisper in the back of your head. Other days, it feels like a freight train. The girl nodded slowly. But you have to be strong, Clint continued. She sniffled again. How? Clint gave her a small, knowing smile, not just for yourself, but for the people who still need you. The girl blinked, the words settling over her like a warm blanket. She hadn't thought about it that way before. She had spent so much time missing her dad, she never thought about who still needed her. Her mom, her little brother, her best friend who didn't always know what to say, but sat with her anyway. She let out a slow breath, feeling something shift inside her. Clint saw it, a small understanding, a flicker of something stronger than sadness. She looked up at him, her big blue eyes a little clearer now, and then she nodded, not a big nod, but a real one, and Clint knew. She understood. The cafe around them kept moving, the hum of voices, the clinking of silverware, the occasional burst of laughter from a nearby table. But for Clint and the little girl, time had slowed. He sat quietly, fingers resting against the worn pendant, his thoughts heavy. Then, with a slow breath, he lifted the chain over his head. The little girl's eyes widened. She watched, frozen in place, as the silver necklace, the one that had carried him through an entire lifetime of hardships, victories, and quiet moments, just like this one, was suddenly resting in his weathered hands. For the first time, she saw him hesitate. It wasn't the hesitation of doubt. It was the hesitation of a man who was about to let go of something that had carried him through every storm. Clint turned the necklace over in his palm, running his thumb along the smooth, time-worn surface. He stared at it for a long moment. Then, before the little girl could even process what was happening, he reached forward and placed it gently in her small hands. She sucked in a breath. Her fingers curled around the cool metal, her chest tightening as she stared down at it. "This helped me when I needed it most," Clint said, his voice steady but filled with something deeper. "Maybe now it's your turn to hold on to it." The little girl's heart pounded. Her hands trembled as she clutched the necklace. This wasn't just a gift. This was a piece of history, a piece of him. Her lips parted, but for a moment, no words came out. Then, in the softest, smallest whisper, she asked, "But this is yours?" Her voice cracked on the last word. Clint gave her a small, knowing smile. Clint let out a soft chuckle, reaching forward to ruffle her curly blonde hair. "Things like this aren't meant to be kept forever," he said, his deep voice gentle. "They're meant to be passed on, to help someone else find their way." The little girl couldn't stop staring at the necklace in her hands. It felt heavier than it should have, not in weight, in meaning. She could still feel the warmth from Clint's hands on the metal. It had belonged to him for so long, and now it belonged to her. Her small fingers curled around the pendant, pulling it close to her chest. She had no words, no way to explain how much this moment meant. So instead, she did the only thing she could do. She looked up at Clint Eastwood, the man with the quiet strength, the man who had lived 100 lifetimes worth of stories, the man who had just given her something she would never, ever forget, and whispered, "Thank you." Her voice barely made a sound, but Clint heard it, and that was enough. The little girl couldn't stop holding the necklace. Her small fingers curled tightly around the worn pendant, as if afraid it might vanish if she let go. Her heart pounded. This wasn't just a gift. This was a piece of a legend. Across the patio, her mother sat frozen, one hand pressed lightly against her mouth. She hadn't spoken a word, hadn't moved, but her eyes shimmered with quiet tears. She had watched the whole thing, the way Clint had listened, the way he had understood, the way he had given her daughter something far greater than an old necklace. He had given her hope. The little girl couldn't hold back any longer. She leapt forward, wrapping her small arms around Clint's middle, burying her face against his old denim jacket. "Thank you," she whispered, voice shaking. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Clint let out a quiet chuckle, patting her lightly on the back. "All right, kid," he murmured. "That's enough mushy stuff now." But he didn't pull away, and for a moment, the world around them, the café, the ocean, the passing time itself, felt completely still. A few nearby café goers who had been eavesdropping without shame exchanged warm smiles. A woman in sunglasses wiped her eyes discreetly. A man at a neighboring table nudged his friend, whispering something neither Clint nor the girl could hear. But Clint didn't care about the attention. He never did. He gave the little girl a final squeeze before pulling back, resting his hands gently on her small shoulders. Then, in the same low, steady voice that had carried him through a lifetime of victories and hardships, he gave her one last piece of advice. "Be strong, kid," he said, "and never stop believing in yourself." She nodded quickly, her blue eyes shining. She wouldn't forget. She couldn't, because this moment, it had just changed everything. Clint stood, stretching slightly, then reached for his coffee cup one last time. The moment was ending. The world, which had paused so perfectly, was starting to move again. He pulled his worn jacket over his shoulders, gave the little girl one final nod, and then, without fanfare, without looking back, he started walking away. The girl watched him go, her breath caught in her chest. She wasn't ready for the moment to end. She wanted to say something else, ask something else, hold on to this feeling just a little longer. But then she looked down at the necklace in her hands. She gripped it tighter. She didn't need to say anything, because he had already given her everything she needed. Clint disappeared down the street, blending into the slow-moving rhythm of the quiet town. But to the little girl, he wasn't gone. Not really. She curled her fingers around the pendant, pressing it against her heart. And for the first time in a long time, she felt strong, not just because of the necklace, because of the lesson he had taught her, because of the moment they had shared. She straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin slightly. She felt different now, lighter, stronger. She closed her eyes and whispered, not to anyone in particular, but to herself, "I won't give up. A pause, a breath, and then, just a little louder, "I'll be strong." The ocean waves crashed softly in the distance, carrying her promise out into the world. And somewhere down the street, walking away from the moment he had just created, Clint Eastwood smiled. Days passed. The little girl still held the necklace close, still pressed it to her heart before bed, still heard Clint's voice in her head when she started to doubt herself. "Be strong, kid." Her mother had watched the entire moment unfold. She had seen something rare, something real, and she knew this wasn't just a memory to hold on to. This was a story that needed to be told. One evening, she sat down at her laptop, hesitating for only a moment before typing it all out. She wrote about the café, about how her daughter had been drawn to a quiet old man in the corner, about the question, the story, the gift, the lesson. She wrote about Clint Eastwood, not as a Hollywood legend, but as a man who saw a little girl in need of hope and gave her something to hold on to. She ended the post with a single thought. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness can change a life. She hit publish, and the world listened. The story spread fast. Within hours, it had thousands of shares. Within days, millions of people had read it. The comments poured in from all over the world. This brought me to tears. We need more people like Clint. A reminder that kindness doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be real. I'm passing this story on. Maybe it'll inspire someone else to do something small that changes everything. News sites picked it up. The world buzzed about it. But Clint, he never acknowledged it. No interviews, no statements, no social media posts. Because he didn't do things for recognition. He never had. But somewhere, in the quiet of his home, he read the story, and he smiled, because he knew Miss Eleanor's lesson was still making its way through the world. Years passed. The little girl grew up. She kept the necklace close to her heart. Through childhood, through the awkward teenage years, through every hard moment where she needed to remember, you are stronger than you think. She carried Clint's lesson with her. And then one day, it was time to pass it on. She was older now, walking through a busy city street, when she noticed someone who reminded her of herself. A child, scared, uncertain, in need of something to hold on to. The moment hit her like déjà vu. She didn't hesitate. She knelt down, took the necklace from around her neck, and placed it gently into their hands. "This helped me when I needed it most," she said. "Maybe now it's your turn to hold on to it." The cycle continued, a small act of kindness that never truly ends. Want to hear more of this? Then click on the video on the right-hand side, which is even crazier.